Om. Today we are meeting a question of one of our students, Juan, who is wondering about naming standards in yoga. It is quite common that in the Indian tradition, where yoga is coming from, that we find a variety of names for one and the same technique, which can be pretty confusing, because some people call the same technique with this name, other people call it with that name. And there might be even a third or fourth name for the same technique. But also it can be the other way around, that we have one name, and with that one name, some people mean this technique, and in other lineages, they are referring to a completely different technique. And another yoga master, or in another ancient scripture, this name seems to be referring to yet another completely different technique. So it is very common that we have this incoherence, a certain inconsistency in the naming standards in yoga, which can be pretty confusing. It can be also frustrating, especially when we come from this Western mindset where we like to have clarity and organized, waterproof certainty that this is this and that is that. And we have two different names for those two different things, and it's very obvious in an ideal world. But this planet is not an ideal one, and human beings on this planet are anything else but perfect. So nobody is perfect, and that's perfectly okay. We are limited editions, and in India we have millions, nowadays even more than 1 billion of limited human beings in their unique expression and edition. So yoga is coming from the Indian subcontinent. It evolved across many centuries, actually even millennia. And there have been a variety of trends and lineages and different religions influencing yoga, different cultures, not only in India itself, but in the neighboring Nepalese, Tibetan Buddhist context, also yoga being practiced, some Muslim influences, some Christian practitioners, this master, those teachers, this lineage, and that type of style which came up in that century, and it's a whole subcontinent across several millennia, and there was never any straight, clear engineer and kind of standardizer who made one canon, one organized structure for the whole thing. It just never happened. So very understandable. We even have it also in the Western world, in science, in different fields of knowledge. Even in the academic context, some professors might mean this with a certain technical term, and in another scientific field it means something completely different. So that is quite common, actually, that we have different significances of words. Even in the regular mainstream language, content, for example, that simple term can be either a noun or an adjective. And it can refer as a noun to the stuff in a bottle, but also to things in a box, etc. But it can also, as an adjective, refer to my harmonious, fulfilled, content state of being. So synonyms, different significances, it's all over. Language standards are never really perfectly accurate. And sometimes there's more variation, other times less. Get used to it. That is the most important recommendation here. So don't get upset. Don't get hung up on it. Don't think like, yoga seems to be very inaccurate because this teacher is calling it like this and that like this. It doesn't make any sense. I want something more straight. Then, I don't know, study mathematics or physics. But even there, the experts are arguing about certain theories and so on. So that's just how it is in life. Don't get upset. Don't get hung up on it. Don't take it personal. Don't blame anyone. It's okay. It's really okay. So it helps, of course, to be in the continuity of one lineage, of one teaching, practicing style, where you read the related books, you have other teachers from that context, and they kind of speak the same language. And then it is more coherent and it makes more sense. And that especially in the beginning when we approach a new field of knowledge, very important and helpful that we have that coherence, because it's anyhow already a lot in the beginning to get all this input. And then if there's even seemingly contradicting input, it can kind of be very confusing, seemingly. So stay in one context, one lineage. So find a school which you resonate with and learn in that field, ideally. But of course, we live in a heterogeneous modern world and we all have a variety of influences, and it's not so easy to find this homogeneous one lineage tradition. So let's look at the question of Juan, who is asking here in our forum. I know the lectures recommend us to be patient with naming inconsistencies. That's exactly what we say. Be patient with it. Relax into it. And I can easily deal with cases like cat-cow pose being Balasana or Shashankasana, or there's other names like Chakrabak-asana for similar poses. He says he can deal with that. It's okay. But I'm really struggling with cases like alternate nostril breathing techniques, which are either called Anuloma Viloma Pranayama, or Nadi Shodhana Pranayama, or Sukhapurvak Pranayama. And there's even other English or Sanskrit words provided. So what he's struggling with, he elaborates later on, is then how can I know when I just see the name of a technique, what should I practice then? And he says that he was receiving in the Shivananda lineage this name with that practice, and then he learned in our yoga course something else about this practice, and then he's a bit confused and unclear. And then he says, when I see any of those words by themselves, I don't know what it refers to unless there is a description or a video accompanying it. My instinct in cases like this is to go back to the sources. But if I check BKS Iyengar's book Light on Pranayama, he seems to call this exercise da 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 da. And in the Shivananda tradition, in another book, The Science of Pranayama, it seems to be described like this. And if I go to Swami Kuvalayananda's 1978 book called Pranayama, this seems to be mentioned as this name, and so on. So very good approach, actually, of Juan here, to go back to the sources. So that is super important to have access to reliable sources. Not just anything, not just what we find in a random Google search, not just what is written in some blog post by somebody saying something who doesn't even mention to us if they come from the Iyengar yoga tradition or if they are more the classical Hatha yogis from the Shivananda lineage or so on. Frequently this is not even mentioned, so that can be then even more confusing and just kind of another subjective opinion, somebody picking up something here and not giving references. It's always very good to have a bibliography, a source list, quoting, referencing where we get certain input from. In an ideal world, we try to be fully transparent on this, but of course, frequently it gets some mixes, overlaps, or lack of presenting all the footnotes and bibliography details in every context. That's just how life goes. So he's asking us then, I wonder how do you teachers decide what word to use to refer to a technique or an idea in a case like this? Perhaps I just picked one of the trickiest cases. Thanks for that question, Juan. So it is one of the tricky cases, but there's many other tricky cases. A lot of other inconsistencies happen. And we do approach it very similarly, actually, as Juan himself was suggesting, looking in some of those ancient sources. That is actually the previous starting point. Juan was rather mentioning some very reliable, acknowledged books of the last 100 years, but we prefer to go back even a few steps earlier as the beginning of our research. We look into the classical scriptures of Hatha Yoga, which started arising around 1,000 years ago, some 1,200 years ago plus. We find the first roots of classical Hatha Yoga, where we find descriptions of the postures known as asana, not just as meditation poses, which were mentioned already thousands of years ago, but as more complex postures, frequently named by animals, the eagle pose, Garudasana, the frog pose, and many others. So yes, we find descriptions of asanas in some of those scriptures, but we also find input on pranayama techniques, what we are talking here about in Juan's question in this context of the alternate nostril breathing that he is wondering about. So we find in scriptures, for example, composed by Goraksha. Goraksha is one of the very early beings in the Hatha Yoga tradition, a student of Matsyendra, who seems to be one of the founding fathers of this whole lineage, coming from the Nata lineage, Matsyendra Nat, from the Natas, Nat lineage. So Goraksha Nat, in his Goraksha Shatakam, or Goraksha Samhita, there's some early scriptures there. He describes some of the asanas and pranayama techniques, as well as also gives some details about the chakras and other aspects. And it continues then with related scriptures like the Geranda Samhita, the Shiva Samhita, and one of the other most famous books is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, composed by Svatmarama, some, who knows, 500-700 years ago or so. So what we find is these very reliable, time-proven scriptures which have more or less detailed explanations about those techniques. Frequently they are very short, those explanations, because it's an esoteric teaching with a secret messaging which is transmitted in the oral direct connection between teacher and student. And in addition, on purpose, they write it in a very cryptic way, short, encrypted, unclear, and already back then also contradictions in the naming standards. Because it comes from a different area of India, some 3,000 kilometers elsewhere on the subcontinent, a completely different lineage, and they just had some similarities but also various differences because it's a couple of centuries later. So the confusion starts already there, and it continues then when we follow our research into the modern times and look at some of the authority sources. For example, some of those books which Juan was mentioning here in his post. Going back, for example, as he found a very good source there, Swami Kuvalayananda from the Yoga Hospital in Lonavla, Kaivalya Dhamma Yogic Hospital and Yoga Therapy place. They've published already in the 1920s magazine line, like a publication, Yoga Mimesa or something like this, on first findings of yoga therapy. Very good source. And also Swami Kuvalayananda did publish a book on pranayama, which Juan is referencing here. So a very good source to go there and see what Kuvalayananda has to say about it. And we could also go to some of the translations which Kuvalayananda did of some of the ancient scriptures. Very good comparative, because there's different versions of those old scriptures in different manuscripts, rolls and so on. So it's a very complex philological analysis, and Kuvalayananda was one of the early thorough ones in that field. So great source. And we could continue with other books that Juan is mentioning here, Swami Shivananda lineage, very influential in the 1950s, 60s, and then continued with the Bihar school of yoga in that lineage of Swami Satyananda. Very thorough research on these topics, very good publications. We highly recommend the Bihar school of yoga books for their clarity. They brought a lot of structure into this more random incoherence and lack of consistency in India. So very good publications used in yoga schools and teacher trainings around the globe. Some of the best manuals of them are, for example, Asana Pranayama Mudra Bandha, which is a famous manual. Other great books in the context are, for example, we have, slipped my mind, Kundalini Tantra is the title of another book which presents advanced pranayama and Kundalini techniques. So there we find references and their naming standard for different pranayama techniques. And many others like B.K.S. Iyengar Light on Pranayama, coming from the Krishnamacharya lineage, very acknowledged, and also one of our main sources in our breath-based Hatha Yoga. So very good one to go back to those sources. Another one which we should mention here is the Renda Brahmachari, who was teaching, for example, the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi yoga and pranayama. So check out those sources as they continue then with Reinhard Gammenthaler into Kundalini Yoga. .ch, this Swiss master yogi who we also studied with. So great sources, and not only different names, as we discussed it before, but if you study with those masters or look up the descriptions in those books, you will see even worse that they also give different variation. And as Juan was asking about the alternate nostril breathing, some teachers would teach this hand mudra, which might be mentioned in a book or not. Others teach that hand mudra. Shashank Mudra, as we learned it from B.N.S. Iyengar in the South Indian yoga capital Mysore, different versions, and then there's different countings in those different alternate nostril breathing techniques, different ways of holding the breath for longer or shorter with full or empty lungs, long inhalation, short exhalation, or the other way around, and oh my goodness. You see, I was overloading you with all those sources and names and backgrounds and the different versions. Just relax into it. Just, it doesn't really matter. Different ways of practicing give you different results. As simple as that. You do it like this, you get a slightly different set of benefits. You do it like that, it has a bit more those effects. As simple as that. And it's not that one is better or one worse or one is the right one, which is very common that humans come with this arrogance, this pride. My teacher, my lineage, it's the best, and I have the most authentic, classical, traditional yoga. Mine is the best version. It will give you the very best results. Sure, there can be more refined, authentic versions than other more superficial, casual, improvised ones, sure. But still, this kind of tight, contracted arrogance of kind of like, oh, mine is the better, or even this is better or this is worse. Not necessarily, just different. So that's already on the level of how to practice these things, and the names, really, they are somewhat secondary. It doesn't really matter. So don't allow your mind to confuse you. In a way, the mind also creates confusion around it. It's kind of like, yeah, but like a certain panic. I'm confused, I'm lost. Like, no, just you learn something from your teacher. You hopefully found a good teacher who is trustworthy, reliable, authentic, genuine. She passes on to you something which they learned from another reliable teacher. It gets handed down over the generations, and we come with a bit of trust, and we just do the practice and then get the benefits. That is what yoga is about. Yoga is 99% practice and 1% theory, as the famous Pattabhi Jois, founder of Ashtanga Vinyasa, said. So do the practice and enjoy the results. So I hope this helps you to relax into the situation. If you're curious, do your homework, Go deeper into the research, ask us for some of those sources. We have a gigantic archive and library where you can draw on these root sources of ancient scriptures and all the modern books which are coming from the authorities, the masters, the sages of the last decades and centuries. So feel free to reach out and ask for further clarification. We are happy to provide, but don't go so much into the theory and trying to figure it out with your mind. Just enjoy the practice and see what happens. Okay, I hope this helps you to flow smoothly. Thanks for the question, Juan, and best wishes for your exploration. Love and light from Bali. Namaste. I hope that these explanations give you at least some more clarity why there are so many different naming standards, and I hope that you have a more refined understanding how you would approach your research, where to find reliable sources. And my question for you is, how did you deal in the past with this misalignment, with these mismatches of different names? And what different names did you encounter? When one teacher said something, the other teacher used a different name. Please share those experiences so other people can see that I'm just not making up these stories, but this is actually happening. So we're curious about your experience, and we're very excited to meet you again rather sooner than later for more of these eye-opening videos on the yoga tradition. So please subscribe to the channel, like the video if it brought some benefits for you, and see you again very soon. Namaste.